Amara tied the strings of her apron with a practiced tug and adjusted her slightly faded name tag. The morning shift at Grayson's Groceries had been steady, customers flowing in and out, their chatter blending with the rhythmic beeping of the register. It wasn't the life she'd imagined for herself, but it kept the lights on. Her pay barely stretched to cover rent, utilities, and the mountain of student loans that seemed to grow heavier every month. The jingle of the entrance bell snapped her from her thoughts. She glanced up to see Mr. Jenkins making his way toward her lane. The elderly man moved slowly, leaning on his cane, his wire-framed glasses slipping down his nose. He clutched his well-loved cloth grocery bag, the corners frayed from years of use. His visits were a bright spot in her days. Always polite, always cheerful, he had a warmth that reminded her of the grandfather she'd lost years ago. "Good morning, Amara," he greeted, placing his small selection of groceries on the counter: a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, some eggs, and a small packet of tea. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," she replied, smiling. "How are you today?" "Oh, can't complain," he said with a chuckle, though his voice carried a hint of weariness. "The knees creak a little louder in this cold, but nothing a good cup of tea won't fix." Amara scanned the items as they chatted. Mr. Jenkins reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet, fumbling slightly as he slid his card into the reader. The machine emitted a harsh beep, its screen flashing the word she hated to see: declined. He frowned, his weathered hands trembling as he tried again. The result was the same. A flush of embarrassment colored his cheeks as he looked at her, his voice low. "I must have forgotten to move some money around. Let's put the milk back." His quiet words tugged at Amara's heart. She'd seen this before: small sacrifices made by people on tight budgets, choosing which necessity to forego. Her mind raced. She wasn't exactly flush with cash herself, but the thought of him leaving without what he needed felt wrong. Without hesitation, she reached beneath the counter for her own card. "No need for that," she said softly. "This one's on me." Mr. Jenkins's eyes widened. "Amara, I can't let you do that." "It's not much," she insisted, swiping her card quickly before he could protest. "You've been such a bright spot in my mornings. Let me return the favor." His hand, steady now, reached out to clasp hers. "You're a rare soul, dear girl." "Thank you." As he shuffled out with his groceries, Amara felt a warmth spread through her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd helped someone in need, but something about this moment stayed with her. She turned back to her work, the hum of the store filling the space where Mr. Jenkins's words still lingered. Later that evening, as she sat in her small apartment eating a simple dinner of reheated pasta, her mind kept returning to the exchange. She wasn't wealthy, far from it, but somehow, helping him had made her own struggles feel lighter. It was just a small act, a fleeting moment of kindness, but it carried a weight she couldn't quite explain. She had no way of knowing that this small decision would ripple outward in ways she could never have imagined. The next morning, Amara arrived at work to find an unusual buzz in the air. Maria, her coworker, leaned on the counter near the registers, her eyes sparkling with curiosity. "You've got a fan?" Maria teased as Amara tied on her apron. Amara frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" Maria pointed toward the manager's desk in the back. "Some older gentleman was here earlier. Said he wanted to thank you for something. Left a package with your name on it." Amara's stomach flipped. Mr. Jenkins, she thought. She hadn't expected anything from him. His gratitude the day before had been more than enough. Curiosity got the better of her, and she headed to the back to see what he'd left. The package was small and neatly wrapped, a plain brown box tied with twine. She undid the knot carefully, lifting the lid to find a handwritten note resting on top of its contents. The paper was thick, and the cursive writing was delicate but slightly wobbly, as if written by a hand unaccustomed to long letters. "Dear Amara." The note began, "Thank you for your incredible kindness yesterday. It meant far more to me than you could know. In a world that often rushes past moments of connection, you stopped to make someone feel seen and valued. Please accept this small token of my gratitude. I hope it brings a little joy to your days, just as you've brought to mine." Amara felt a lump in her throat as she set the note aside and peered into the box. Inside was a pouch of loose-leaf tea, the same kind Mr. Jenkins had bought yesterday, and a tin of shortbread cookies tied with a gingham ribbon. The thoughtful simplicity of the gift made her heart swell. As she pulled the items out, a second envelope fell to the floor. Picking it up, she saw her name scrawled neatly across the front. Inside was another note, this one shorter. "If you're free, I'd love for you to visit. There's something else I'd like to share with you. My address is below." The gesture touched her deeply, but it also stirred a sense of curiosity. What could he possibly want to share? She glanced at the clock on the wall. Her shift ended at 3. Maybe she'd have time to stop by. The hours passed quickly, her mind occupied with thoughts of Mr. Jenkins. When the clock struck 3, she grabbed her jacket and the package he'd left, feeling a mix of nervousness and excitement. The address he'd written was only a few streets over, in a quiet residential neighborhood. Amara walked briskly, the chill of the afternoon air nipping at her cheeks. When she reached the small brick house, she noticed the garden in front carefully tended, with late-blooming flowers and a bird feeder swaying gently in the breeze. The curtains moved slightly, and moments later, the door creaked open. "Amara," Mr. Jenkins said warmly, his face lighting up. He wore a sweater over a colored shirt, and though his frame seemed frail, his smile carried an energy that belied his age. "I'm so glad you came. Please come in." She stepped into the cozy living room, which smelled faintly of lavender and old books. The walls were lined with framed photographs, many of them showing a younger Mr. Jenkins standing beside a woman with a bright smile. "Your wife?" Amara asked gently, gesturing to one of the pictures. Mr. Jenkins nodded, his expression softening. "That's Eleanor. She was my heart and soul. She passed 5 years ago, but I still feel her presence every day." "I'm so sorry," Amara said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. "She was an extraordinary woman," he continued, leading her toward a small room at the back of the house. "And she left me with something I'd like to share with you." Amara stepped into the room, which was cozy but cluttered with books and notebooks stacked on nearly every surface. A desk by the window held an old typewriter, its keys worn with use. Mr. Jenkins picked up a notebook from one of the piles and handed it to her. "Eleanor loved to write," he said. "She believed in capturing life's little moments, acts of kindness, connections between strangers, the beauty of the ordinary. These notebooks are filled with her stories." Amara opened the notebook carefully, her eyes scanning the first few lines of a story written in neat cursive. It was about a woman at a train station who helped a young boy reunite with his mother. "She had a gift," Amara said softly. "Every word feels alive." Mr. Jenkins nodded, his smile tinged with melancholy. "Eleanor always said that kindness was like planting seeds in a garden. You never know how or where they'll bloom, but they always make the world more beautiful." He gestured to the stacks of notebooks. "Since she passed, I haven't had the heart to do much with her work. But yesterday, your kindness reminded me of her spirit. I think she would have wanted me to share this with someone who understands." Amara's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Jenkins, are you saying?" "I want you to help me bring these stories to life," he said simply. "I can't do it on my own, and I think Eleanor would have trusted you to carry them forward." Her heart raced. She was just a cashier, someone barely scraping by, but as she looked into Mr. Jenkins's hopeful eyes, she felt a pull she couldn't ignore. She nodded slowly. "I'd be honored." Amara left Mr. Jenkins's house that day with one of Eleanor's notebooks tucked under her arm. The weight of it felt heavier than she expected, not physically, but emotionally. It wasn't just a collection of stories. It was a legacy. A part of Mr. Jenkins's life and his late wife's passion. The idea of helping bring it to life filled her with both excitement and uncertainty. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm. After her shifts at Groceries, Amara would head to Mr. Jenkins's house, where they'd sit at the desk in his study and sift through Eleanor's stories. The notebooks were brimming with tales of everyday kindness: a child who left a painted rock in a park to cheer up strangers, a bus driver who waited an extra minute for an elderly passenger, a woman who returned a lost wallet with everything intact. Each story felt alive, as though Eleanor had captured the world's quiet, unnoticed beauty in her words. Amara typed the stories into her laptop while Mr. Jenkins reminisced, sharing anecdotes about Eleanor's inspirations. She always believed that the smallest acts of kindness could ripple out in ways we'd never see, he said one evening as Amara worked. She used to say that no good deed is ever wasted, no matter how small. Amara paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Do you ever feel like you don't see the ripples? Like the world doesn't notice? Mr. Jenkins leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Oh, plenty of times. But Eleanor used to remind me that it's not about being noticed. It's about knowing you planted the seed. Her chest tightened at his words. She thought of her own struggles: the endless bills, the uncertainty of whether she could even afford groceries some weeks. And yet, helping Mr. Jenkins that day at the register had reminded her of something she'd nearly forgotten: the power of connection. One chilly afternoon, as they worked on a story about a stray dog Eleanor had once rescued, Mr. Jenkins looked up from his chair. Amara, may I ask you something? Of course, she replied, glancing away from her screen. Why did you help me that day? At the store. She hesitated, thinking back to the moment. I've been in your shoes, she said finally. I know what it's like to worry about money, to wonder if you can make it through the week. I guess I just didn't want you to feel that way, even for a moment. He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. And in doing so, you gave me something priceless. Eleanor would have said that's the essence of kindness: it multiplies, often without us realizing it. Amara smiled, feeling the truth of his words settle deep within her. As their work progressed, Amara suggested sharing the stories with the local community. Maybe we could print a small booklet, she said one evening. Something simple, for people to read and remember how powerful kindness can be. Mr. Jenkins's face lit up. Eleanor would have loved that idea. She always dreamed of her stories reaching others. They began compiling the tales into a cohesive collection, selecting the ones that resonated most. Amara worked late into the nights, typing and editing, while Mr. Jenkins wrote introductions to explain Eleanor's vision. The project gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Her life of long shifts and endless bills now felt richer, filled with meaning and connection. When the first printed copies of the booklet arrived, Amara could hardly believe it. The cover was simple but elegant, featuring a delicate illustration of a blooming garden, a nod to Eleanor's philosophy about kindness. The title, Stories from Eleanor's Garden, felt perfect. On the day of the booklet's small launch at the local library, Amara felt nervous. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. The library's event room was modest, with rows of folding chairs and a table displaying the freshly printed booklets. Mr. Jenkins, dressed in his finest tweed jacket, gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder. You've done something remarkable here, he said. Eleanor would be so proud. To Amara's surprise, the room filled quickly. Neighbors, co-workers, and even regular customers from Grayson's Groceries came to hear about the project. As Mr. Jenkins introduced the booklet, sharing memories of Eleanor and her passion for storytelling, Amara watched the faces in the crowd. There was something magical about seeing people connect with the stories, nodding along or smiling softly as Mr. Jenkins spoke. When it was her turn to address the audience, Amara hesitated, gripping the edges of the podium. I never thought I'd be part of something like this, she began. But working on these stories has changed the way I see the world. It reminded me that kindness doesn't have to be big to matter. Sometimes, the smallest gestures can mean everything. The audience applauded, and Amara felt a surge of pride she hadn't experienced in years. By the end of the event, nearly all the booklets had been taken. People lingered, thanking Amara and Mr. Jenkins for sharing Eleanor's stories. a young woman approached Amara with her daughter in tow, saying, "This is exactly the kind of thing the world needs right now." As they packed up for the evening, Mr. Jenkins turned to her, his eyes shining with gratitude. "You've given Eleanor's stories a new life," he said. "And in doing so, you've created something beautiful for yourself." Amara smiled, feeling the truth of his words. The ripples were beginning to spread, and she had no doubt they'd go far beyond what she could see. After the success of the library event, stories from Eleanor's garden began to ripple through the community in ways neither Amara nor Mr. Jenkins had anticipated. Word spread quickly about the heartfelt collection of stories, and soon Amara was receiving requests for more copies from people who hadn't been able to attend the launch. Local businesses offered to display the booklets on their counters, and even the local high school asked if they could include the stories in a kindness initiative for their students. Amara was overwhelmed but exhilarated. She'd never imagined that her decision to help Mr. Jenkins at the register that day would lead to a growing community inspired by Eleanor's legacy. One afternoon, as she stocked shelves at Grayson's Groceries, Maria appeared at the end of the aisle with a grin on her face. "Hey, superstar," she said, holding up her phone. "You're in the local paper." Amara blinked in surprise. "What?" Maria handed her the phone. The headline read, "Local Cashier brings kindness to life through stories." The article detailed the origins of the project, highlighting how Amara and Mr. Jenkins had worked to bring Eleanor's stories into the world. There was even a photo of the two of them at the library event, surrounded by smiling attendees. "That's wild," Amara said, feeling a mixture of pride and disbelief. "It's more than that," Maria said. "You've done something amazing. People need stuff like this, especially now." As Amara returned to her work, the article lingered in her mind. It wasn't the attention that mattered to her, but the thought that Eleanor's stories might truly be making a difference. It gave her a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known she was missing. Later that week, Mr. Jenkins called her with more news. "Amara," he said, his voice brimming with excitement, "a local publisher reached out. They read about the booklet in the paper and want to meet with us." Amara almost dropped her phone. "A publisher? Are you serious?" "As serious as Eleanor was about her tea," he replied with a chuckle. "They're interested in producing a full book, a hardcover collection of her stories, with some photographs and reflections about her life." The prospect left Amara speechless for a moment. A hardcover book. Something permanent. Something that could reach far beyond their small town. "When's the meeting?" she finally asked. "They'd like to see us tomorrow," Mr. Jenkins said. "Will you come with me?" "Of course," she said without hesitation. The next day, they met with a representative from a local independent publishing house. The meeting took place in a cozy office filled with bookshelves and the scent of freshly brewed coffee. The publisher, a middle-aged woman named Clara, was kind and enthusiastic. "Your story," Clara said, addressing Mr. Jenkins and Amara, "is exactly what people need right now. Eleanor's words, paired with your efforts to preserve and share them, are a testament to the power of kindness and connection. We'd be honored to help bring these stories to a wider audience." Clara explained that they would work on designing a beautiful hardcover edition, complete with illustrations and photographs of Eleanor's notebooks and personal mementos. She suggested a small advance to cover the initial production costs, with royalties to follow once the book was published. Amara couldn't believe it. The thought of Eleanor's stories reaching people far and wide felt surreal. But what struck her most was how the project had grown from something so small. A single moment of kindness at the grocery store had bloomed into something extraordinary. When the meeting ended, Mr. Jenkins turned to Amara, his expression filled with gratitude. "I never imagined this would happen," he said. "But I think Eleanor did. She always had faith in the magic of connection." Amara nodded, her heart full. And she was right. The months that followed were a whirlwind for Amara and Mr. Jenkins. The publisher kept them busy, requesting photographs, edits to the stories, and personal reflections about Eleanor's life and her philosophy on kindness. Amara poured her heart into the process, learning as she went, For the first time in years, she felt her days were filled with purpose. When the hardcover edition of Stories from Eleanor's Garden was finally printed, the publisher arranged a release event at a local bookstore. Amara arrived early, helping to set up the display table. The books were beautiful, with a delicate floral design on the cover and Eleanor's name written in elegant script. Seeing the finished product left Amara breathless. It was more than a book, it was a testament to the ripple effect of kindness. As the evening began, the bookstore filled with people. Neighbors, co-workers, and even strangers came to celebrate the launch. Amara spotted a few familiar faces from Grayson's Groceries, including Maria, who waved enthusiastically from the back of the room. Mr. Jenkins, seated beside her at the signing table, looked both proud and overwhelmed. During the event, Clara, the publisher, took the stage to share a few words. She spoke about how Eleanor's stories had reminded her of the importance of everyday compassion, and how Amara's decision to help a stranger had set everything in motion. Kindness is contagious, Clara said, addressing the audience, and this book is proof of what it can inspire. When it was Amara's turn to speak, her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the microphone. She looked out at the crowd, her heart full of emotion. I never imagined that something as small as helping someone with groceries could lead to all of this, she began. But working on this book with Mr. Jenkins has shown me how powerful small acts of kindness can be. Eleanor's stories remind us that even the simplest gestures can create connections, change lives, and leave a lasting legacy. I hope this book inspires all of you to plant those seeds of kindness wherever you go. The crowd erupted into applause, and Amara felt a warmth she hadn't known in years. The weight of her struggles, the endless bills, the long hours at work felt lighter now, replaced by a sense of fulfillment she hadn't thought possible. After the event, as the last guest trickled out and the bookstore staff began to clean up, Mr. Jenkins turned to Amara with a look of quiet satisfaction. Eleanor would have loved every moment of tonight, he said, his voice soft. And I think she would have been especially proud of you. Amara smiled, her eyes misting. None of this would have happened without you, Mr. Jenkins. Or Eleanor. Kindness brought us together, he said, his voice steady. And it will carry us forward. As the weeks passed, the book's impact continued to grow. Orders began coming in from neighboring towns, and even a few regional bookstores reached out, wanting to stock stories from Eleanor's Garden. Amara started receiving letters from readers' notes filled with gratitude for the stories and for the reminder that small acts of kindness could create profound change. One evening, as Amara was closing up at Grayson's Groceries, Maria approached her with an envelope in hand. This came for you, she said, grinning. Amara opened it cautiously, her eyes widening as she read the contents. It was a letter from a national bookseller, expressing interest in carrying the book in their stores across the country. They believed its message was universal and had the potential to inspire people far beyond their small town. The news felt surreal. Amara rushed to Mr. Jenkins's house to share it with him, and when she told him, his eyes filled with tears. This is more than I ever dreamed, he said, his voice breaking. Eleanor's words are going to touch so many lives. Amara nodded, her own emotions threatening to spill over. And it all started with you. No, he corrected gently. It started with you. You made the choice to help, even when you didn't have much to give. As Amara walked home that night, the stars overhead seemed brighter than usual. She thought about how far she'd come, not just in the journey with the book, but in her own life. Her struggles hadn't disappeared, but they no longer defined her. She felt a sense of hope, of possibility, and a quiet joy she hadn't known before. What had started as a simple act of kindness at a grocery store counter had grown into something extraordinary, weaving lives together in ways she never could have imagined. And as she thought about the stories still left to tell, and the kindness yet to share, she knew her journey was only just beginning.